Rembrandt Harmensen van Rijn was born on July 15, 1606, in the city of Leiden, in the Dutch Republic, modern-day Netherlands. Situated on the banks of the Rhine River, Leiden was a bustling center of commerce, scholarship, and craftsmanship during the early 17th century. The city's thriving intellectual climate, supported by the prestigious Leiden University, founded in 1575, provided a fertile ground for Rembrandt's formative development, even though his destiny would lead him beyond the world of books and lectures. Born into a relatively comfortable middle-class family, Rembrandt was the ninth child of Harmen Gerritsen van Rijn, a miller, and Neeltgen Willemsdochter van Zutbroek, a baker's daughter. The family's modest prosperity allowed young Rembrandt access to formal education, a privilege not afforded to every child of his social standing. This early stability would later contrast with the emotional and financial turbulence of his adult life, making his childhood a foundational period of peace and structure. In a city where the Reformation had reshaped spiritual and cultural life, the values of discipline, thrift, and individual responsibility were deeply ingrained. These values informed the rhythms of Rembrandt's early environment and may have contributed to his strong personal drive. Although his family was not artistically inclined, they recognized the value of education and supported his early academic journey. In 1615, at the age of 9, Rembrandt enrolled at the Latin School of Leiden, where he received instruction in classical literature, theology, and languages. Despite his immersion in academic studies, Rembrandt's interest in art began to take precedence. Around the age of 14, he entered Leiden University, likely more to satisfy his parents' aspirations than to pursue a scholarly career. His time at the university was brief. The allure of painting soon proved irresistible. This decision marked a significant turning point in his life, a conscious departure from the expected path of intellectual or clerical success to pursue a more uncertain and individualistic vocation. His choice to pursue art seriously led him to an apprenticeship under Jacob van Swanenburg, a relatively obscure painter known for his depictions of hellish scenes. Swanenburg, having studied in Italy, introduced Rembrandt to the techniques of composition and perspective, as well as the use of dramatic light effects. Although their time together lasted only about 3 years, this period provided Rembrandt with essential technical skills and a foundational appreciation for the emotional and narrative potential of painting. In 1624, after leaving Swanenburg's studio, Rembrandt continued his artistic development in Amsterdam under the guidance of Peter Lastman, a prominent history painter renowned for his vivid biblical and mythological scenes. Lastman's influence on Rembrandt was profound. He introduced the young artist to complex storytelling, expressive gestures, and rich coloration, all hallmarks of Baroque art. These elements would later resurface in Rembrandt's mature works, though filtered through his increasingly introspective lens. The contrast between his small-town upbringing in Leiden and the vibrant artistic world of Amsterdam likely had a lasting impact on Rembrandt's worldview. Leiden, though intellectually rich, was conservative in its cultural output, while Amsterdam exposed him to the broader visual languages of Europe, imported through trade and diplomacy. This duality of influences, rooted tradition and cosmopolitan experimentation, became a defining feature of his artistic identity. During his time back in Leiden in the late 1620s, Rembrandt began to establish his own studio and take on students, even at a young age. His early works from this period already exhibit a striking command of light and shadow, often portraying figures in dramatic poses or intense emotional states. These experiments, while still tethered to his teacher's styles, indicated the emergence of an independent voice. Even as a young artist, Rembrandt showed a particular interest in the human condition, seeking depth in expressions and realism in physical detail. By the end of the 1620s, Rembrandt had already begun to attract attention for his distinctive style, particularly in his portraiture and historical scenes. He was lauded for his ability to imbue faces with lifelike emotion and for his bold use of contrast. While his name had not yet reached the heights it would later attain, the seeds of his artistic genius were already sown during these early years. cultivated by the cultural, educational, and familial environment in which he was raised. In a modest, sun-dappled studio above the narrow streets of Amsterdam, a young Rembrandt stood with palette in hand, observing the way light spilled through the small window and caught on the folds of a model's garment. The room smelled of linseed oil and pigments ground fresh that morning. Ochres, siennas, and lead white. This was the crucible of his transformation, a space where the murmur of the city outside faded beneath the intense silence of artistic concentration. Under the guidance of Peter Lastman, Rembrandt was no longer just a promising student. He was becoming a visual storyteller. Lastman's studio was a world apart from the quietness of Leiden. It buzzed with energy and ambition. Paintings in progress leaned against the walls. Mythological banquets, angelic visitations, tragic martyrs caught in the grip of their final breath. Lastman was meticulous, demanding precision in drawing and clarity in composition. Each lesson was a dive into the symbolic language of gesture, drapery, and expression. Rembrandt absorbed it all, not by imitation, but by internalizing the rules so he could later bend them. While many pupils would have contented themselves with mastering technique, Rembrandt grew fascinated with the psychological complexity embedded in each narrative. He began to sketch not just figures but emotions, the confusion in a man's eyes, the quiet dread before a prophecy, the exhaustion of a fallen warrior. These weren't merely visual exercises. They were explorations into the human psyche. Even his earliest biblical scenes glimmered with a sense of internal drama, as though he saw each story not as historical fact, but as a mirror to modern life. When he returned to Leiden around 1625, his transformation was undeniable. The lines of his figures became bolder, the contrasts sharper, the stories more layered. No longer content with conventional symmetry or polished elegance, Rembrandt infused his work with tension. Figures often twisted, faces partially obscured, shadows stretching across scenes like silent narrators. His brushwork, still tight and deliberate, now carried a hint of rebellion. It was during this period that he began experimenting with etching, a medium that would become central to his career. Etching offered him a different kind of intimacy with his subjects. The sharp point of the needle on the wax-covered plate allowed for expressive line work, and the inky impressions on paper captured even the faintest hesitation of his hand. These etchings, while often small in size, held a magnitude of detail and intensity. They served as a visual diary, raw, immediate, and personal. In his studio, the boundaries between genres began to blur. A supposed historical scene might resemble a portrait of a neighbor, while a simple figure study could evoke the gravitas of a religious icon. This ambiguity was not confusion, it was intentional. Rembrandt sought to collapse the distance between viewer and subject. The effect was startling. One did not merely observe his work, one entered it. The models he chose reflected his democratic eye. He painted beggars with the same intensity he afforded biblical prophets. Elderly faces, furrowed with age and hardship, became monuments to endurance. Youth, too, appeared in his works, but rarely in idealized form. He preferred the real to the refined, and the imperfect to the polished. This commitment to authenticity, unusual among his peers, marked a turning point in his approach to art. His studio became a laboratory of light. Candles, windows, and oil lamps were moved and tested at various angles. He would often sketch a subject multiple times under different lighting conditions, fascinated by how a single beam could redefine form and emotion. Light was no longer just a means of visibility. It was a force of revelation. It revealed not only surfaces, but secrets. Rembrandt's training did not end with his mentors. It evolved through rigorous self-study. He would frequently stand before a mirror, making faces, twisting his features, observing how muscles contorted and expressions flickered. These self-portraits, at first simple studies, grew into profound exercises in self-confrontation. Even in these early attempts, the viewer could sense a mind both inquisitive and vulnerable. By the late 1620s, the apprentice had become a master in his own right. Commissions began trickling in, modest but consistent. Word spread of a young painter in Leiden whose works seemed to speak, not just depict. The canals of Amsterdam glistened with the reflected light of a burgeoning city. In the early 1630s, it was a place in motion, growing, thriving, and shifting with the ambitions of a merchant republic at the height of its golden age. Ships docked from all corners of the world, bringing spices, fabrics, and art. The city pulsed with the energy of new money, civic pride, and a hunger for culture. Into this fertile atmosphere stepped Rembrandt van Rijn, still young, still relatively unknown, but already brimming with vision. He arrived not as a wanderer, but with a sense of purpose. The move from a more provincial Leiden to the capital of commerce and culture was strategic. Amsterdam offered what Leiden could not: access to wealthy patrons, established collectors, and a city whose walls were increasingly lined with portraits and allegorical scenes. The art market in Amsterdam was no longer the exclusive domain of church commissions or aristocratic patrons. It was a business open to those who could offer something exceptional. Rembrandt intended to do just that. He initially settled in the house of Hendrik van Wylenberg, an influential art dealer and portraitist whose business was located near the Oude Kerk. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Van Wylenberg supplied Rembrandt with steady commissions, and in return, Rembrandt brought talent, energy, and a new style that quickly attracted attention. It was in this house, part studio, part gallery, that Rembrandt's early Amsterdam years began to take shape. The commissions came swiftly. His reputation as a portraitist grew as he painted members of the city's elite: surgeons, merchants, and regents. These were not static, lifeless likenesses. His portraits crackled with personality and psychological insight. A sitter's eyes might betray tension behind a composed expression, or a gesture might suggest status without ostentation. Clients, intrigued by this depth, flocked to have themselves immortalized not as icons, but as individuals. Amsterdam was also a city of intellectual curiosity, and Rembrandt found himself at the intersection of several cultural and philosophical circles. He interacted with scholars, collectors, and artists who shared his fascination with antiquity, anatomy, and human expression. Cabinet rooms filled with curiosities, fossils, exotic shells, ancient sculptures, were part of the visual vocabulary of the age, and they appeared subtly in his compositions, adding layers of symbolism and intrigue. The city's diversity left a strong imprint on his work. Jews, Armenians, Africans, and Eastern Europeans were visible in the neighborhoods and occasionally found their way into his paintings and etchings. Rembrandt did not exoticize them. Rather, he portrayed them with quiet dignity and realism, as individuals caught in the same sweep of human experience. In a city bursting with difference, he developed an inclusive eye that welcomed every wrinkle, fold, and gaze. Not long after his arrival, Rembrandt took over many of the duties in Van Wylenberg's studio and began managing his own team of assistants and apprentices. The studio became a crucible of creativity. Canvases in progress leaned against the walls. Pigments were ground daily in mortars. Models waited patiently as he moved among them, giving quick instructions or adjusting the light by pulling shutters. He taught not just technique, but observation, the art of seeing beyond the surface. By now, his technique had matured into something unmistakable. The layers of paint became thicker, the brushstrokes more confident. Faces emerged from shadows, as if summoned by memory. His fascination with dramatic narrative extended beyond religious or mythological subjects. He found story in everything. A simple portrait could suggest a past and future, inviting the viewer into a silent dialogue with the subject. Amid this whirlwind of productivity, Rembrandt's finances flourished. His earnings allowed him to begin collecting. He acquired prints, ancient busts, fabrics, weapons, and shells. Objects that not only inspired his compositions, but also revealed his curiosity for worlds beyond his own. These treasures surrounded him, creating a personal museum of reference and wonder. His collection would later grow legendary, not for its monetary value, but for its scope and eclecticism. By the mid-1630s, Rembrandt was no longer merely an artist in Amsterdam. He was a name. Collectors knew him, patrons sought him, and critics discussed him. He had entered the elite circle of painters whose work could shape taste. The boy from Leiden had not just moved to Amsterdam. He had conquered it, not with charm or lineage, but with a brush that captured humanity in all its contradiction and beauty. In the heart of Amsterdam's bustling Jodenbrestraat, Rembrandt's home and studio stood as a temple of art and instruction. The tall, narrow house, acquired during the height of his fame, was more than a dwelling. It was a multi-story hive of creativity, where ideas flowed as freely as paint. The structure itself, with its spacious workshop and rooms filled with curiosities, reflected his aspirations. It was both a sanctuary for introspection and a stage for education. Within these walls, Rembrandt gathered not just brushes and canvases, but minds. Young artists from across the Dutch Republic and beyond sought him out, eager to learn from the man whose portraits seemed to breathe and whose biblical scenes burned with life. The students arrived with varied backgrounds, sons of merchants, aspiring craftsmen, occasional prodigies. To be admitted into Rembrandt's studio was to enter an unorthodox school, one driven not by formula, but by a deep engagement with the world and the self. Unlike the rigid artistic guilds or formal academies of the time, Rembrandt's teaching was informal yet immersive. He did not prescribe rules so much as he nurtured instincts. He emphasized observation over tradition, urging his pupils to study faces in the marketplace, to watch how children played, how old men prayed. In his view, art was not born in theory, but in the raw intimacy of life's small gestures and grand dramas. His studio was filled with props, oriental fabrics, antique armor, taxidermy, musical instruments, and weathered manuscripts. These objects became tools of imagination, draped over models or arranged into allegorical scenes. Students were often tasked with creating entire compositions using these props, challenging them to think narratively and symbolically. It was not enough to replicate reality. They had to reinterpret it through feeling and form. Among his most notable pupils were artists who would later gain their own fame: Gerrit Dou, Ferdinand Bol, and Govert Flinck, to name a few. Each one bore traces of Rembrandt's influence, yet none were carbon copies. He encouraged individual style, knowing that true mastery could only arise from authenticity. This, too, set his teaching apart in a time when many masters demanded imitation as the foundation of apprenticeship. Discipline in the studio was both rigorous and fluid. The days were long, the expectations high. Rembrandt would often work alongside his students, pausing to critique a brushstroke or demonstrate a passage of drapery. He was known to be both encouraging and exacting. Praise, when given, carried weight. Mistakes were not punished, but examined. Every error, he believed, was a window into deeper understanding. Yet teaching was not only about art. Through his mentorship, Rembrandt instilled a sense of philosophical inquiry. He spoke of light not only in technical terms, but as metaphor, of suffering not only as subject matter, but as a source of truth. He treated painting as a moral endeavor, an act of searching for meaning rather than merely creating beauty. This ethos imbued his studio with a quiet intensity, a sense that each work, however small, mattered. The presence of students also served Rembrandt's own practice. Surrounded by younger eyes and restless energy, he stayed connected to the evolving tastes and techniques of a new generation. Their questions forced him to articulate his own process. Their experiments challenged him to refine his ideas. Teaching, for Rembrandt, was never a one-way transmission. It was an ongoing dialogue between artists. His house, filled with sketches, half-finished paintings, and the muffled chatter of apprentices, became a living organism, constantly in motion, shaped by the rhythms of learning and creation. Guests and patrons occasionally wandered through, watching the master at work, marveling at the environment that so seamlessly blended the personal with the professional. It was a studio, a school, and a home, each identity feeding the others. Behind the heavy doors of Rembrandt's bustling studio, beyond the smell of turpentine and the constant murmur of apprentices, lay a world far more intimate and complex, the painter's domestic sphere. While his public life was filled with acclaim and creativity, his private world bore the weight of great emotion, tenderness, and eventual sorrow. At its heart stood Saskia van Willenberg, the woman who would bring light into his home and leave a shadow on his soul. Saskia was no mere muse. She was his partner, confidant, and emotional anchor. A woman of refined taste and cultivated manners, she came from a well-to-do Frisian family. Their meeting was more than a romantic spark. It was a union of sensibilities. She was the cousin of Rembrandt's art dealer, and her social connections enhanced his reputation. But more importantly, she believed in his genius. In her presence, his work grew more nuanced, more daring. Her features appeared again and again in his paintings, sometimes regal, sometimes playful, always layered with affection. Their marriage in 1634 was modest in ceremony, but rich in promise. The couple's new home on the Jodenbrestraat soon became not just a center of artistic activity, but a place filled with the rituals of shared life. Saskia adorned the rooms with touches of elegance, fine linens, delicate ceramics, soft curtains that filtered the morning light. In those early years, joy colored their days. Guests were entertained, ideas exchanged, and Rembrandt painted her with a gaze reserved only for her. Yet, life in 17th century Amsterdam was as precarious as it was prosperous. The rhythm of childbirth and loss soon crept into their home. Saskia gave birth 4 times. Only their 4th child, a boy named Titus, survived beyond infancy. The death of each child was a quiet devastation, casting shadows through their otherwise sunlit home. Rembrandt, though rarely expressive in words, poured his sorrow onto canvas. The subtle melancholy that began to enter his paintings during these years was not imagined. It was lived. Titus's arrival in 1641 was a moment of renewed hope. The child was robust, with wide eyes and a curious mind. Rembrandt adored him, capturing his likeness in drawings that reveal a father's gentle awe. For a brief period, domestic life seemed to settle into a rhythm. But happiness in Rembrandt's world was often transient. Saskia's health began to decline soon after Titus's birth. Tuberculosis, then a silent and relentless killer, consumed her vitality little by little. As Saskia's illness progressed, the tone of the household changed. The once lively rooms grew quieter, the scent of medicines mingled with oil paints, and laughter became rare. Rembrandt remained by her side, watching the woman who had once posed as a goddess, a bride, and a noblewoman in his paintings grow frail and pale. Her final months were marked by a soft dignity that only deepened his admiration. When she died in 1642, barely in her late 20s, she left behind not only their son, but a void that Rembrandt would never fully fill. Grief settled over him like a second skin. In the months that followed, his work took on a new texture, darker, more introspective. He painted less of youthful exuberance and more of solitude and contemplation. Even when he depicted others, it was as if he saw them through the veil of his own mourning. The household, now consisting of father and infant son, adjusted to a quieter, more fragile existence. In time, domestic needs demanded practical decisions. Rembrandt hired a nurse, Gertje Dirks, to care for Titus. Gertje's presence in the house marked a shift, from a home filled with romantic love to one marked by necessity and, eventually, controversy. Their relationship, ambiguous and fraught, would later end in legal conflict, but during her tenure, she played a significant role in stabilizing the home. Yet she could never replace what had been lost. The household dynamic remained tense and shifting. Eventually, a new woman entered Rembrandt's life, Hendrik Stoffels, a young maid who would become his quiet companion and, in many ways, a balm for his sorrow. But this chapter of his personal life was far less public. With Hendrich, he found comfort rather than passion, stability rather than sparkle. She, too, would be immortalized in his paintings, not as an idealized muse, but as a real woman, full of tenderness and strength. Inside the quietude of his studio, Rembrandt began to unravel the mysteries of light. While others pursued precision and polish, he pursued truth. Not the literal truth of appearances, but the emotional reality shaped by flickers of illumination and the density of shadow. For Rembrandt, light was not a decorative element. It was a narrative force. With it, he sculpted mood, carved out silence, and brought his subjects to the brink of revelation. His command of chiaroscuro, the technique of using stark contrast between light and dark, became his signature. Unlike the Italian masters who often used it for theatrical effect, Rembrandt employed light with intimacy and restraint. A single beam might illuminate a widow's hands in prayer or catch the glisten in a tear, while the rest of the scene remained cloaked in gloom. In these contrasts, he revealed not only form but feeling. One of his most remarkable innovations was his treatment of skin and fabric. He developed a technique of layering paint in ways that mimicked the texture of flesh, the shimmer of velvet, or the coarseness of linen. Thick impasto strokes were applied to highlights, making parts of the canvas almost sculptural, while other areas were thinned to translucency. His surfaces came alive under changing light, revealing subtle shifts as the day passed. Rembrandt also began experimenting more radically with composition. He abandoned traditional symmetry and spatial clarity, often placing figures off-center or cloaking important elements in shadow. This created a sense of immediacy and drama. His subjects felt caught in mid-thought, mid-movement, mid-life. The viewer was not simply an observer, but a participant in the scene, drawn into its psychological gravity. In his religious paintings, he veered away from grandeur and majesty, instead humanizing sacred figures. His Christ was often tired, worn, even weeping. Saints appeared aged and poor. These were not idealized visions from Scripture, but deeply empathetic interpretations that spoke to suffering, grace, and humility. In his hands, biblical scenes became mirrors of everyday human struggle and divine mystery. His group portraits, too, broke with tradition. The most famous among them, The Night Watch, was not a stiff row of civic pride, but a dynamic orchestration of movement, mystery, and interaction. Figures emerged from shadow, some blurred in action, others sharply lit. It was a revolutionary portrayal of a city militia, not as static icons, but as a living, breathing community. While it confused some viewers at the time, it marked a daring evolution in portraiture. Equally daring were his self-portraits. Over the years, he painted himself more than 70 times, not out of vanity, but out of inquiry. In these images, he confronted his own aging face with brutal honesty. He depicted himself laughing, brooding, pondering, wearing rich attire or simple robes. These were not mere likenesses. They were philosophical meditations on identity, mortality, and the role of the artist. Few had ever turned the mirrors so inward. Rembrandt also delved deeply into etching, a medium that allowed for spontaneity and repetition. His etched lines were loose, often experimental, capturing fleeting moods or narrative vignettes with economy and grace. These prints circulated widely and added to his fame, making his work accessible beyond the walls of Amsterdam's elite homes. In etching, he was not confined by scale or commission. He was free to explore. Among his lesser-known innovations was his use of costume and role-playing. He frequently dressed his subjects, or himself, in Eastern robes, antique armor, or exotic fabrics. These disguises were not mere flights of fantasy, but tools for transformation. They allowed him to explore timeless themes, power, introspection, vanity, wisdom, through the lens of myth, history, and theater. His sitters became actors, each performance etched in paint. The city that once celebrated Rembrandt as a luminary began, over time, to turn its gaze elsewhere. Amsterdam, ever dynamic and mercantile, was evolving. Tastes shifted, fortunes changed, and the art world responded in kind. The clean elegance of classicism and the polished serenity of newer portraiture began to eclipse Rembrandt's moody chiaroscuro and expressive realism. As younger artists captured the imagination of wealthy patrons, Rembrandt found himself increasingly out of step with prevailing trends. It was not only artistic fashion that changed, but also the structure of patronage itself. The new merchant elite, keen on showcasing refinement and control, favored art that mirrored their aspirations, graceful, orderly, adorned. Rembrandt's paintings, with their emotional intensity and refusal to flatter, no longer aligned with this ideal. Clients became more hesitant. Commissions slowed. Some works were even rejected, including notable pieces he poured himself into, misunderstood by an audience that now sought polish over depth. Behind the scenes, his finances unraveled. Rembrandt's appetite for collecting prints, costumes, antique curiosities had never waned, nor had the cost of maintaining a large household, especially with dependents like his son Titus and his partner Hendrik. His grand house on the Jodenbrestraat, once a symbol of his success, now loomed as a burden. The debts mounted year after year, tightening like a vice. In 1656, unable to stave off creditors any longer, Rembrandt was forced to take a drastic step. He filed for bankruptcy. The declaration marked a bitter turning point. His possessions were cataloged and sold off in public auctions. The inventory was extensive. Artworks, rare objects, household goods, all scattered into the hands of strangers. His beloved studio, once the heart of his creative life, was lost. The walls that had seen the birth of countless masterpieces were emptied, stripped of memory. He and his family relocated to more modest quarters, and with this move came a change in social standing. Once welcomed by Amsterdam's elite, Rembrandt now found doors closed and reputations altered. Patrons no longer sought him with the same fervor. Invitations ceased. He became a figure both revered and avoided, admired from a distance, but no longer embraced by the circles he once commanded. The legal implications of his financial collapse were just as severe. To protect what little remained, Rembrandt maneuvered carefully, placing ownership of his future works and assets under the name of his son Titus and Hendrik. This arrangement allowed him to continue painting and selling art, though now indirectly. Even so, his means were limited, and the security of his household depended heavily on Hendrik's prudent management and Titus's growing responsibility. Through it all, Rembrandt kept working. He painted not to appease, but to endure. His palette grew earthier, his brushwork looser, and his subjects even more introspective. There was no audience to impress now, only truth to capture. His canvases from this period seem to whisper rather than proclaim. They carry a quiet dignity, born of hardship and reflection. The decline in fortune had stripped away all that was external. What remained was essential. Hendrik bore the weight of their survival with quiet strength. Though publicly censured by the church for living in sin with Rembrandt, she stayed by his side, raising Titus and managing the household's strained resources. Her death in 1663 dealt yet another blow, one more intimate loss in a life already defined by absence. Her passing left a void, not only in Rembrandt's home, but in his resilience. Titus, now a young man, stepped into the role of protector and provider. He continued the business arrangement that allowed his father to paint while shielding their earnings. For a brief while, stability seemed within reach. But fate would not relent. In 1668, Titus died unexpectedly, just months after his marriage. The grief was indescribable. Rembrandt, now in his 60s, was left alone, without his beloved Saskia, without Hendrik, and now without his only son. The painter who had once stood at the pinnacle of fame now walked among the shadows of anonymity. His name was still known, but spoken more in reverence for past glories than for present triumphs. Yet even in decline, his spirit endured. In the dim, rented rooms of his final years, he continued to observe, to sketch, to paint. Not for acclaim, but because it was his way of understanding the world and perhaps of surviving it. In the twilight of his life, Rembrandt's paintings assumed a new gravity. The theatrical gestures and grand compositions of earlier years gave way to silence, contemplation, and a profound sense of interiority. No longer bound by the expectations of wealthy patrons or the conventions of his peers, he painted with the quiet freedom of a man who had little left to prove and everything still to express. His final canvases are not statements, but meditations. The subjects of these late works are striking in their simplicity. Old men with sunken eyes, women wrapped in coarse cloth, scholars lost in thought, and beggars resting on worn steps. They populate his paintings like ghosts of a world grown still. These figures are not idealized or allegorical. They're deeply human, rendered with an empathy that goes beyond observation. In their tired gestures and soft gazes, the viewer finds not only realism, but reflection. Color, in these final years, took on a more subdued, earthy tone. The once vivid reds and golden hues gave way to muted browns, ochres, and grays, shades that seemed drawn from the soil itself. This tonal restraint did not suggest dullness, but depth. Like the dim light of dusk, his palette invited the eye to adjust, to linger, to discover layers that were not immediately apparent. In the softness of the tones, a kind of wisdom resided. Texture, too, played an essential role. Rembrandt's brushstrokes became more expressive, often thick and seemingly impulsive. Paint was not just a means of depicting form. It became part of the subject's emotional language. In some portraits, layers of impasto rise from the surface like scars, as if the canvas itself had aged with the sitter. His technique grew increasingly personal, almost sculptural, as though the paint carried the weight of memory. Perhaps no work embodies the introspective power of this period more than his later self-portraits. In them, we see an artist stripped of illusion, staring directly into the face of time. His features are worn and sagging, his eyes tired yet searching. There is no effort to hide imperfection. Instead, he records it with fidelity and grace. These images are not about identity in the public sense, but about the essence of being. Each self-portrait is a quiet dialogue with mortality. Biblical themes continued to occupy his attention, but now they were infused with a deeper emotional resonance. One of his final masterpieces, The Return of the Prodigal Son, captures this evolution. The scene is rendered with striking intimacy. The father's hands rest gently on the back of the kneeling son, while the surrounding figures watch with quiet reverence. The light is warm but dim, the space undefined. Everything converges on the act of forgiveness, conveyed not through drama, but through touch. There is a tenderness in these final religious paintings that seems to arise from personal experience. The figures no longer represent abstract virtues or moral lessons. They are people marked by hardship and longing. They embrace, mourn, pray, and wait. Through them, Rembrandt seemed to search for meaning in the losses he had endured. His faith, never doctrinaire, took form in the small gestures of love and compassion. Though he received fewer commissions, a small circle of admirers remained loyal. They recognized in his later work a depth that could not be found elsewhere. Among them were younger artists who, though working in different styles, respected the fearless honesty of his vision. To them, he was not an old man in decline, but a master still shaping the soul of painting. The physical toll of age was evident. His hands trembled slightly, his health faltered, and the world outside his studio moved on without him. Yet Rembrandt's routine rarely changed. Each day, he returned to the easel, to his pigments and brushes, as if fulfilling a quiet ritual. The act of creation had become not just his vocation, but his refuge, a way to commune with the world, with memory, and perhaps with the divine. In the last months of his life, Rembrandt worked with the same devotion that had defined his youth. The difference was that now, there was no audience but himself. His final works are in essence, letters he wrote to the silence. When he died in October 1669, he left behind no grand estate, no heirs to carry on his name. What remained were the paintings, silent, eternal companions that bore witness to a life deeply felt and honestly told. The city of Amsterdam, in all its movement and prosperity, scarcely noticed when Rembrandt van Rijn died. On the 4th of October, 1669, the man who had once captivated the Dutch Republic with his art passed away in relative silence. There were no public tributes, no grand memorials, and no processions through the bustling streets. He was buried quietly in the Westerkerk, not in a family vault or marked grave, but in an unremarkable rented plot, destined by church policy to be reused after 20 years. His burial record noted only the essentials: his name, his date of death, and the location. No elegy accompanied the entry. The man who had once illuminated canvases with divine light was consigned to the earth without flourish. The city moved on. Ships came and went through the canals, traders shouted in the markets, bells rang from towers, and the ground closed silently over one of the greatest painters in Western art. No immediate biographer took up his story. His letters, if ever abundant, were lost or scattered. His last years remained largely undocumented except through his art. Even in artistic circles, his name faded beneath the growing reputations of younger, fashionable painters whose styles mirrored the refined tastes of a new age. The heavy emotion and unvarnished humanity of Rembrandt's late work no longer aligned with the polished elegance that defined the Dutch Golden Age's final chapters. Within his modest lodgings, little was left behind. The possessions that once filled his stately home had long since been sold. There were no dramatic discoveries, no forgotten masterpieces tucked in corners. The remnants of his life, pigments, brushes, perhaps a few etchings, were ordinary things, used daily and worn down by time. They bore the wear of devotion, not the gleam of wealth. Among the few to mourn him were those closest to his final, quiet circle. Friends, perhaps a patron or two, and members of the workshop who had witnessed his unwavering discipline. They had seen him paint with steady hands, even in grief, had observed the old man squinting in a fading light as he etched one final line. They carried with them not only admiration for his genius, but all the quiet strength with which he faced life's relentless hardship. Outside those intimate circles, Rembrandt's death went largely unremarked. There were no printed obituaries, no calls for retrospective exhibitions. The few prints that circulated bore little indication of the man behind them. His reputation, once vast and celebrated, became muted in the years following his passing, overshadowed by changing tastes, political shifts, and the fickleness of public memory. The art market, always susceptible to trends, moved quickly. Collectors sought newer works, brighter colors, and more decorous scenes. Rembrandt's paintings, with their raw emotion and textured surfaces, were considered unfashionable, difficult, even primitive by some critics of the time. Dealers undervalued his canvases. Some were attributed to his pupils or incorrectly cataloged altogether. Paintings that once hung proudly in grand homes found their way into storage or were repainted to suit contemporary tastes. The memory of Rembrandt the man, too, began to blur. With no surviving spouse or direct heirs, there was no one to shape his legacy. His character, his voice, his gestures, these vanished with the generation that had known him. What endured were his works, and even those stood in the shadow of anonymity for a time, misinterpreted or dismissed by a world rushing forward into the elegance of the Enlightenment. In the decades that followed, his name began to echo faintly once again in academic halls and private collections. Scholars in other countries, particularly in Germany and later France, started to examine his works with fresh eyes. There was something timeless in them, something unaffected by the vanities of any single era. But this reawakening was still in its infancy, a faint stirring that hinted at a legacy not yet understood. As time wore on, the shadow of Rembrandt's life began to lift, and his work emerged once again into the light. The first stirrings of rediscovery came from an unlikely source: the growing interest in the profound emotional depth that his paintings possessed. The world that had once been captivated by his skillful renderings of light and shadow now began to appreciate the human soul embedded within his brushstrokes. In this way, Rembrandt's art shifted from being merely admired for technique to being revered for its emotional resonance, something timeless and universally relatable. In the 19th century, the art world underwent a dramatic transformation as Romanticism, with its focus on the individual and the emotional, began to dominate. It was here that Rembrandt's work found new admirers. His late self-portraits and his portrayal of biblical subjects with a raw, emotional honesty spoke directly to this new wave of thinking. Artists and critics, many of whom had once overlooked or even dismissed him, began to re-evaluate his approach to painting. His works were no longer just canvases. They were windows into the human condition itself, capturing joy, suffering, and redemption with unparalleled authenticity. The French art critic and historian Jean Ruskin was among the first to elevate Rembrandt to the status of a master. He wrote extensively about Rembrandt's ability to express the profound depth of character and emotion in his figures, something that had previously been absent from the traditional, idealized depictions of the time. As Ruskin's writings spread, they sparked interest in Rembrandt among the growing number of Romantic painters. These artists saw in him a kindred spirit, a man who had defied conventions in his pursuit of truth in art. Soon, Rembrandt's influence began to seep into the work of some of the most renowned artists of the 19th century. Eugene Delacroix, the leader of the French Romantic movement, praised Rembrandt's ability to portray emotional intensity through his use of color and light. The great French painter was inspired by the way Rembrandt's figures seemed to come alive with psychological complexity. In England, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of artists dedicated to bringing emotional truth to their work, also turned to Rembrandt for inspiration, especially in their use of color and texture to create an almost tactile sense of life in their subjects. The rise of modernism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw Rembrandt's legacy firmly planted in the canon of Western art. While movements like Impressionism and Expressionism seemed to push away from his style, they could not escape the profound impact of his exploration of light, shadow, and human emotion. Even Pablo Picasso, during his Blue period, reflected the melancholy and introspective quality of Rembrandt's later works, particularly in the solemn faces and quiet moments of his subjects. Rembrandt's influence did not remain confined to the realm of painting. His work had a deep impact on the development of photography and cinema. The dramatic use of chiaroscuro in his paintings laid the groundwork for many photographers, especially in the early days of the medium, who sought to create mood and atmosphere through light. Filmmakers, too, borrowed from Rembrandt's lighting techniques, using strong contrast between light and dark to convey psychological depth in their characters. As the centuries passed, Rembrandt's work moved from private collections to public museums. His paintings found their rightful place in the most prestigious institutions around the world, from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam to the Louvre in Paris, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Exhibitions dedicated to his art became events of international significance, drawing crowds from all corners of the globe. People stood before his paintings in reverence, captivated by the intricate details and the soulfulness captured within the brushstrokes. His legacy had come full circle from neglect and obscurity to worldwide acclaim. The changing world of art collectors and critics also helped ensure that Rembrandt's work was preserved for future generations. His works were carefully studied, restored, and cataloged. His innovative techniques were analyzed, and scholars began to trace the evolution of his style from his early studies to the profound psychological depth of his late works. Rembrandt was no longer seen as an artist who had fallen out of favor with the changing tides of his time, but as a timeless genius whose relevance transcended the constraints of any one era. By the late 20th century, Rembrandt was firmly established as one of the greatest painters in the history of Western art. His name had become synonymous with artistic mastery and emotional depth. No longer was he the misunderstood, bankrupt artist of his last years, but rather a towering figure whose influence spanned centuries. The old man who once faced poverty and obscurity now stood as a monumental figure in the history of art, with his works permanently etched into the collective consciousness of the world. Today, the story of Rembrandt is not just one of an artist's rise and fall, but a tale of resilience and rebirth. From his humble beginnings in Leiden to the grand days of fame and fortune, to the quiet end of his life, his journey is a testament to the power of art to transcend personal circumstance. Rembrandt's legacy is not just in his mastery of light, shadow, and texture, but in his unparalleled ability to convey the human experience. His art, always deeply personal, speaks to us across centuries, capturing the joy, sorrow, complexity, and beauty of life itself.